Welcome to the webinar from melamine to dead pigs to bird flu. Can food safety become a game changer against industrializing meat production in China? Hi, my name is Ben Lilliston, the Vice President of Program at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. IATP works locally and globally for fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade policies. Earlier this month, IATP released 4 reports on China's feed, pork, poultry, and dairy sectors, the past and future trajectory of the industry, and global impacts of their focus on increasing production of cheap meat. You can find all 4 papers at iatp.org. So this is the third in a series of webinars looking at the impact of China's growing meat production. Our previous webinars looked at China's growing need for animal feed and the story behind China's rapid transition toward an industrial model of livestock production and associated social and environmental impacts. Today we will examine some of the connections between China's meat boom, animal welfare, and recurrent food safety scandals. We're joined by 3 speakers. Shefali Sharma is the Director of Agricultural Commodities and Globalization at IATP. Shefali is leading IATP's initiative on the social and environmental impacts of an increasingly globalized and concentrated meat industry. Her work in the past year is focused on China's meat and feed industries, the culmination of which are the 4 IATP reports we released earlier over the last week or 2. Over the last 18 years, Shefali's work is also focused on accountability of international trade and financial institutions, international trade and agricultural policies, and their implications for social justice. Our second speaker will be Dr. Peter Li, Associate Professor of East Asian Politics at the University of Houston, downtown. Dr. Li is also China Policy Specialist of the Humane Society International, the global arm of the Humane Society of the United States. His research covers areas such as animal agriculture, transnational wildlife trade, and Northeast Asian international relations. Dr. Li conducted a survey of China's industrialized animal farming and its impact on food safety, environment, and public health in 2005 and 2006. And Dr. Li has written about China's wildlife protection policy, wildlife farming, youth animal welfare awareness, and Chinese scholarly inquiries of animal rights and animals in Chinese ancient philosophies. Our third speaker will be Tony Corbo, Senior Lobbyist at Food and Water Watch. Tony is responsible for food-related legislative and regulatory issues that come before Congress and the executive branch. Tony has extensive organizing experience, having directed major public employee representation campaigns in several states. He's also directed political campaigns at various levels, and he served as the administrative assistant to a member of Congress. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Public Affairs from the George Washington University and a master's degree in Industrial and Labor Relations from Cornell University. All right, so before we get started, I wanted to remind people who are participating here that it's very easy to ask questions as we go throughout these presentations. In your pop-up GoToWebinar thing on the right side of your screen, you have some options there, and one of them is questions. And if you just click on that questions button, a little text space will pop down, and you can send questions at any time during the presentations, and I will sort through them, and we will answer the questions at the end. But just keep sending them throughout the presentation or at the end, and we'll try to get to as many as we can given the time allowed here. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Shefali.
Thanks. Oops. Just 1 second. Okay, thanks, Ben. So many Chinese policymakers and experts believe that the solution for food safety is further industrialization of China's meat and dairy industry, and the U.S. meat industry has been their model. I want to highlight some of the findings from our own reports that address some of the structural issues that we think are contributing to food safety problems. One scandal after another has broken out in China over the last years. A prominent one was the melamine contamination in milk in 2008, which sickened over 30,000 children and resulted in 6 infant deaths. Last year, China made headlines over the floating dead pigs incident, when over 10,000 dead pigs were found in the Huangpu River near Shanghai. The floating pigs, ironically, were a result of the crackdown by Chinese authorities to ensure that pigs that died of disease were not used for stuffing Chinese dumplings and did not end up in the food chain. Many illegal operations just dumped them in the river to avoid punishment. Then there was the KFC instant chicken scandal in December 2012, when antiviral drugs and hormone residues were found in KFC chicken. It was dubbed the instant chicken scandal because as many as 18 chemicals were discovered in the chicken, and these chemical cocktails facilitate the growth of a broiler to 5 pounds in just 40 days. This cartoon shows in very violent and graphic terms the apparent beating that the KFC Colonel took from McDonald's after consumers stopped eating at KFC restaurants following the scandal. And finally, making the headlines these days is the H7N9, a highly contagious and deadly form of bird flu that emerged last spring in China and reappeared again as a slightly different strain this winter, having already killed at least 1 person in southern China. One critical factor linked to all of these problems is the sheer scale and speed with which meat is becoming industrialized, with a dramatic rise in the concentration of animals in confined spaces. But there are also major structural issues with the industrial model that China has adopted. The emphasis is on scaling up and consolidation of the industry. Chinese policymakers see scale, standardization, and consolidation, both vertical and horizontal, as the 3 pillars of modernizing meat production. This slide shows the dairy supply chain. We have retail and processors on one end and silage imports and feed companies on the other. In between, we have middlemen and actual producers. As I discussed in the previous webinar, the dairy industry has immense price competition, and the few years leading up to the scandal, we saw very few companies controlling the price for the dairy. 10 companies controlled over 60% of the market, with 4 controlling most of that. And small producers were making less and less money as feed costs continued to rise. So you had an oligopolistic market, with companies paying below the cost of production. At the same time, we saw a tremendous boost in output. Look at the years between 2003 and 2006. At the same time as producer prices were facing losses, production was going up. This is precisely the point at which contamination in milk reached crisis levels. In the end, 22 dairy companies were blamed for the scandal, including Yili, Mengniu, Bright, and Sanlu. Sanlu was 40% owned by New Zealand's Fonterra, and which no longer exists after the scandal. But mainstream media also portrayed the small producers as the culprits, and post-scandal, the government sought to eliminate small producers and consolidate and scale up the sector even further as a result of the scandal. Today, we see the same problem of oligopoly in the infant formula market, and we see further consolidation in the dairy sector as a whole. This slide shows the intense concentration of poultry farms up and down the eastern coast. You can see in the brown where it's most concentrated, and this is also the region where bird flu is most prominent. And most of these farms are under contract with poultry companies that demand cheap poultry with quick turnaround times. This slide clearly demonstrates the link between rising output and the emergence of bird flu. At a certain point in the massive growth of poultry, there's a sharp break around 1996, and that's the emergence of bird flu in the world, which first came from China. Since then, you can see all the years when bird flu reoccurs. China has reported cases of avian flu every year since 2003, with the exception of 2011. And the 2013 flu killed 44 people with 135 cases reported. In the last webinar, we talked about the massive rate at which the poultry industry has industrialized and how it's the fastest growing meat segment in China. With Chinese companies such as New Hope, which doubles as a feed company, emerging on the global scene. In 2012, Wen's and New Hope were ranked number 5 and 6 in the world. Again, we see this in pork as well, massive output, and then after a certain point, a massive disease outbreak. In this case, the porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus, or the blue ear pig disease in 2006, which killed massive numbers of pigs. And again, consolidation and control by very large companies, creating downward pressure on prices down the value chain. This shows the number of dragonhead companies. Dragonheads are companies that reach a certain scale in vertical integration to receive support from the government. These powerful companies control virtually all parts of the supply chain. This slide shows how these diseases and problems impact the supply domestically and therefore the hog price, which in turn influences the imports into China. So U.S. exporters are also interested and impacted by this cycle. Finally, what our reports found was that food safety actually created a dramatic shift in consumer preferences. So when the avian flu and the dead pigs incident happened last year, people started shifting to beef, and beef imports from Australia went up. And because of bird flu, soybean demand for feed dropped by 4 million tons. Whether coincidentally or not, China canceled soy shipments from Brazil, citing infrastructure bottlenecks as the reason to cancel the contracts. But we can conjecture that the canceled contracts could have also been linked to the sharp drop in soy feed demand in China. Also in dairy, Chinese consumers started relying on foreign brands for milk powder after the melamine scandal. So some concluding thoughts. First, if food safety is to be addressed in China, then the model needs to be questioned, including structural problems associated with scale, industrialization, buyer power, and intense price competition that incentivizes cheap producer prices. Right now, the government continues to scale up and consolidate the industry, creating more buyer power at the top of the value chain to provide cheap meat and dairy at any cost. But given rising consumer concerns on food safety and how quickly they react, can consumers and policymakers begin to make structural linkages between food safety problems, scale, buyer power, and the cost of cheap meat and dairy? Could food safety, in effect, eventually change the way meat is produced and consumed in China? And these issues are all touched in these 4 reports that we launched last week, and Peter Lee is also going to address these questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shefali, and also thank you, Mr. Lillestone, for the introduction and also for inviting me. I'm going to talk about animal welfare, public health, and the future of China's intensive meat production. Okay, let me go to the slideshow. Can you see my screen? Hello? 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 Hello?
Peter, we can hear you. Please just go to slideshow mode.
Okay. Sorry. And you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. If you go to the bottom bar, you can go to slideshow mode. Thank you.
Okay, can you guys see my see the title of the presentation? Hello? Okay, I'm going to talk about animal welfare, public health, and the future of China's intensive meat production. As you know that meat consumption in China has grown exponentially. If you look at this chart, the per capita consumption rose from about 15 kilogram in 1983 to almost 63 kilogram in 2010. Now this increase of meat consumption has a lot to do with the industrialization of China's animal farming industry. If you look at all this, looks like a very familiar scene of industrialized animal farming in many parts of the world. And you see the enormous animal suffering, and to control disease epidemics, massive use of drugs. And you see this picture which were taken by one of our partner groups in China last year. And, from, breeding to slaughter, the entire process involves, large scale of, industrialized, farming, practices, and you see this, transport. And this is the result of the long-distance transport. Now, the stress for, farm animals in, transport, can be shown in this, map. You see the routes, there are 4 major, consumption centers in China: Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And some of those, transportation routes can be more than 1,000 miles. So, what are the consequences of intensive, production in China? Animal health threat, more than 200 diseases, threatening, China's farm animals. According to a study by China's, scientists. Now, these are the issues, drug resistance and, disease caused by suppressed immune system, and obstacle to disease control and prevention, and a high frequency of disease outbreaks. Sorry, I'm experiencing some problem here. Now, China's chief scientist, pointing out that epidemics is the biggest problem, threatening China's, animal farming industry. And in response to the situation of, frequent animal epidemics outbreak, China's, State Council issued in 2012 a directive to all the, government agencies and the local governments to pay special attention to the control of animal epidemics. And of course, in the last 12 years, the Chinese government has issued every year, directives to local governments on the control and prevention of epidemics. So it is a serious problem. The Chinese public, majority of the Chinese public have no idea of the serious conditions on the factory farms until that, until the the frequent occurrence of, human health, problems, and also other, issues impacting, human health. China is becoming fatter. You can see this cartoon, published by China Daily. So obesity has been a big problem. China News, Daily, which is a newspaper owned by the government, and addressing, issues related to the youth population, published, data about the rising, overweight, population in the country. If you look at the total population overweight in China, which stands at 325, which is bigger than the United States population. Now, People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's, official, organ, also published, article on, the overweight population, situation in the country, based on data from the, state public health ministry. And also there is other, issues related to diabetes situation. And about half of the Chinese population are with, diabetes or, having pre-diabetes. So this is an enormous situation. If you look at, compare with the United States, which is 11.3% of Americans with diabetes. Now China is 11.6%. And the most important to look at is that less than 1% of Chinese with diabetes in 1980, when, industrialized animal farming was at the very, early stage. Now today, goes up, enormously, more than half of the population with diabetes or pre-diabetes situation. So animal welfare, people may ignore, but, human welfare they have to face. And also, as a result, I'm not going to go into all these small details, but, China has, more than 200, million people with, cardiovascular, vascular disease, CVD. And this is also a situation, recognized by the Chinese government in a special report published in 2010. And, in terms of major causes of death, 40% of the deaths were caused by, CVD in China. And cancer, right? Between 1980 and the last few years, there were an 80% increase of deaths from cancer. And this is also the result from a Chinese government, sponsored report. And and also, Chinese Minister of Public Health, pointed that out as well. Now, a strong connection between, dietary, structure in China and also, CVD disease, several reports, look at the dietary, habit of, ethnic minorities in China, for example, Tibetans. Now, there were a higher, rates of, CVD, patients among Tibetan, adults as opposed to other people in China. Largely because the diet is predominantly, animal, protein, and much less, vegetable and fruits. And also important, now the public cannot ignore animal welfare issue or intensive animal farming issue because of, public health impact. What about the government? The government can also not ignore the issue because, public health is becoming a threat to, political stability. So I would put down, reduce security threat as a way to, show that the government is paying attention, because it put enormous, pressure on the government to provide, public health care for the large number of, people with the CVD and other, illness. I'm not going to draw a conclusion, but I'm going to, highlight some of the issues, going forward for China's industrialized animal farming. So one of the questions is intensive animal production going to continue? And the answer is yes. Why is yes? Because of course there is an urban-rural consumption gap. If you look at this data, you see that the vast rural area, which has about 50% of the population, it's less meat compared with urban areas. And this is also a comparison of the consumption between urban and rural residents. And also, we have to understand that meat supply is not a national security issue; it's more a regime security issue. That's why China has a strategic pork reserve mechanism. And animal agriculture is also a rural, economy, booster, and a major, job creator. And also, importantly, to look at that per capita consumption in China is lower than in the West. If you look at China and the United States, you can see the difference. Consumer response. I would say that, as Shefali just mentioned, that outbreak of animal disease could impact consumption and market demand, and this is also true in China. And that's why, with, in 2013 and 2020, because of fear of, bird flu, people, stay away from, poultry consumption. So the government officials has to, demonstrate that it's safe to, eat chicken. And this, cartoon, shows that. So people are making, choices not based on price, but based on product safety. Now we have to understand, yes, health, safety, product safety awareness, animal welfare awareness, mostly I would say, food safety awareness is rising. And China, of course, is seeing, more and more people going vegetarian. So all these factors, I would say, on the one hand, yes, there will be industrialized animal farming will continue. But there are all these factors we have to take into consideration that may put pressure on the government to rethink the strategy going forward. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Tony, go ahead.
Okay. I want to thank IATP for sponsoring this webinar and inviting us to participate. I wanted to cover a couple of issues that Food and Water Watch has been tracking on Chinese imports, and some of the trends here domestically that should serve as warning signs to China and other countries that are developing their meat and poultry food safety systems. Wanted to start with the case of China and imported processed poultry. In December 2003, the United States experienced its first case of a cow diagnosed with bovine spongiform encephalopathy, commonly known as mad cow disease. And as a result of that, our export markets for beef closed around the world, including China. In 2004, USDA began the process to reopen those markets, and when China was approached, China requested that it be permitted to export processed poultry to the United States in exchange. And so USDA honored the request and conducted audits of Chinese poultry, of the Chinese poultry inspection system in December of 2004 and again in July and August of 2005. And what resulted from that was kind of a bizarre proposed rule. I call it, why did the chicken cross the Pacific? Because in November 2005, the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS, proposed a rule that would grant China equivalency status to export processed poultry to the United States, provided that the raw poultry came from an approved source. And at the time, the only two approved sources were the United States or Canada. The public comment period closed on January 23rd, 2006. And most of the comments, and they didn't receive very many comments, there were about 40 comments, but most of the comments that were filed were opposed to the rule. The only comments that USDA received in favor of the rule were from Chinese entrepreneurs. Because there have been outbreaks of H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza in China, and some of these outbreaks had not been disclosed, and that caused some concern at USDA, in particular with the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS. APHIS would not permit the importation of poultry meat processed from Chinese poultry. And as in this rule, APHIS also insisted that the processed poultry that was going to come back to the United States needed to be cooked. What was really odd about the disposition of the final rule was that it received only a one-day review at the White House Office of Management and Budget. Normally, on what's considered to be a major policy change or a major rule that is going to cost either the government or industry substantial amounts of money, OMB normally takes about 90 days. And in this case, it was only 1 day. And what happened 2 days after that final rule got to OMB was that Chinese President Hu Jintao visited President Bush. And on August the 20th, this rule was presented to President Hu Jintao. China never certified any poultry plants under this April 2006 final rule because it was only interested in exporting its own poultry to the United States. While that was going on, Congress became concerned about the specter of Chinese poultry exports to the United States. And in 2006, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a provision in the FY 2007 Agriculture Appropriations Bill that precluded USDA from spending any money that would implement any regulations that would permit the importation of Chinese poultry products. And because the Senate that year did not complete the appropriations process, the provision died. But the Congress did come back in 2007 and 2008 and put that provision in those two appropriations bills for those 2 years. As a consequence of that action, China filed a World Trade Organization complaint that it eventually won in September of 2010. In December 2010, FSIS returned to China to conduct new audits of the poultry processing and slaughter facilities. Deficiencies were found in both audits, including the lack of government inspection personnel in the plants and plants not consistently implementing their hazard analysis critical control point plans. FSIS returned to China in March of 2013 to conduct new audits of the poultry processing and slaughter facilities and to see if China had addressed the concerns that were expressed in 2010 as a result of those 2010 audits. On August 31st, 2013, FSIS announced that it had reaffirmed its April 2006 equivalency determination for processing facilities, but was not prepared to propose a rule that would permit China to export its own poultry to the United States. China, as of today, still hasn't certified any poultry processing plants, and of course, since they're not able to export their own poultry to the United States, they're not taking any of our beef. What's been happening in recent years is that U.S. poultry processors have set up shop in China. Tyson Foods is now operating 3 poultry facilities in China. It recently announced that it had acquired a Chinese hatchery business so that it can establish a fully integrated poultry operation in China. Cargill, in this past fall, recently opened a $250 million state-of-the-art processing facility in Lian-Anhui. And OSI opened its 10th processing facility in China in October 2013. McKee Food Services, a subsidiary of Keystone Foods. Keystone Foods was the inventor of Chicken McNuggets, and you can guess what they're doing in China. They're supplying Chicken McNuggets to the McDonald's that are in China. Another issue that's been on our radar screen is that there's been an outbreak of deaths and illnesses among U.S. dogs that have consumed Chinese jerky treats manufactured in China. And at the urging of members of Congress in 2012, FDA investigators visited 5 of the Chinese pet treats manufacturing facilities. Chinese food safety officials would not permit the FDA investigators to take samples of the product so that the agency could conduct its own testing. One of these pet treats facilities was eventually prohibited from exporting any of its products to the United States because there was a falsification of its ingredients records. What that company was doing was listing that it had been importing industrial grade glycerin when in fact it was food grade glycerin, and because of the different tariff structure they were avoiding paying tariffs. But FDA became concerned that they were falsifying their records, and so they prohibited that company from exporting any more jerky treats to the United States. In January 2013, Nestle Purina and Del Monte Foods recalled their pet treats manufactured in China because the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets found traces of antibiotics in their pet treats that were not approved for use in raising poultry in the United States. In October 2013, at the urging of both Food and Water Watch and some of the pet victims, pet family victims. They updated the number of illnesses and deaths associated with these products, and as of October 2013, 580 dog deaths and 3,600 pet illnesses were attributed to pets consuming these pet treats from China. But FDA continues to investigate the issue, and we're no closer to finding out why these pets are dying from consuming these products. In the meantime, Nestle Purina has started to sell pet treats imported from China again. They are assuring the U.S. consumers that they only have a single supplier from China, and they're continually monitoring the food safety of that facility. And but Del Monte has announced that it has stopped importing pet treats from China and has started to source their jerky treats from other Asian countries, including Thailand. U.S. consumers have taken action. There is currently an online petition initiated by 3 mothers of school-aged children who are asking key congressional leaders, the Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and President Obama, to prevent any processed poultry products from being served in any of the school nutrition programs administered by USDA. They are citing China's poor food safety record as the reason. And as of this morning, the petition has a little over 307,000 signatures. A group called Animal Parents Against Pet Treats and Food Made in China, composed of pet owners who have had pets get ill from Chinese pet treats, has initiated several petitions on the issue. They initiated a petition that was directed to Nestle, urging them to recall their products a couple of years ago. Their latest petition was delivered last week to the Food and Drug Administration, urging the agency to implement a provision of the new Food Safety Modernization Act that would require grocery stores to post warning notices in conspicuous places, specifically at the cash registers. Warning notices that would inform consumers of any dangerous human or pet food that has either been recalled or where there has been a public health concern expressed. Is the U.S. model the one for China to emulate? We've already heard from the previous speakers about the concentration that already exists in China, but look at what we have here in the United States. 82% of our beef packing is controlled by the 4 largest companies. The 4 largest companies here in the United States controls 63% of the pork packing. 53% of the broiler chicken packing is controlled by 4 companies. And many farmers and ranchers are forced into unfair take-it-or-leave-it contracts with the large meat packers that keep prices low because of the lack of competition. On the food safety side, there has been this trend here in the United States to deregulate inspection. Up until 1996, USDA administered a command and control system for meat and poultry inspection. The regulations were very prescriptive, and USDA inspectors conducted hands-on inspection in slaughter and processing facilities. As a result of 1993 foodborne illness outbreak that was associated with hamburger patties contaminated with E. coli sold in the Jack-in-the-Box fast food chain, and there were 4 deaths and 600 illnesses attributed to that outbreak, USDA proposed a radical change to the way meat and poultry facilities were inspected. And the basis for the changes came from a citizens petition filed by the American Meat Institute, which represents some of the biggest meat packing companies here in the United States. In 1996, USDA finalized a rule that would transfer the responsibility for the safety of meat and poultry products to the industry. It was called the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points Pathogen Reduction Rule. And each plant was required to develop a HACCP plan or food safety plan that would identify any point in production where possible contamination was likely to occur and what measures would be taken to deal with the contamination. The full impact of this rule was primarily confined to processing facilities. And so it was hamburger facilities, for example, those grinders would be subject to this rule. The plants that made pepperoni pizzas, they were subject to this rule. And what happened was that the role of the USDA inspectors' primary responsibility was taken from a hands-on approach to where they were just verifying whether the company was following its own HACCP plan. The implementation of HACCP in this country has had tons of problems. First and foremost, the USDA inspectors were never fully trained as to what their roles were under this new inspection regime. USDA never evaluated the efficacy of the company HACCP plans before they were implemented. The companies just wrote these plans up, and the inspectors were expected just to verify whether the company was following their plan, and there was no evaluation as to whether the plans were worth the paper they were written on. And so a number of the USDA inspectors have been quoted in the media calling HACCP "have a cup of coffee and pray," because their inspection rules were severely reduced, and they were being asked to verify plants' food safety procedure based on food safety plans that had questionable scientific validity. Since the implementation of HACCP and processing, USDA has proposed extending this model to meat and poultry slaughter facilities, and it plans to export that model abroad. And in fact, it has recognized a HACCP-based inspection models system in Australia and New Zealand, and there have been some recent articles that have appeared in those countries, where those countries have encountered problems with food safety because the companies now control the inspection process. What should we encourage China to do? We should encourage China to develop a robust food safety regulatory system that is based on a strong government-administered inspection program. China does have a decentralized food safety system, and there needs to be consistency in the way food safety policies are administered in that country, but it has to be based on a strong government presence and not rely on the companies to regulate themselves. Transparency needs to be part of the food safety culture in order to build consumer confidence both domestically and abroad. And China needs to encourage the development of smaller meat and poultry processors and not rely on the oligopolies. And we urge that the Chinese beware of the U.S. companies setting up shop in their country, because they are behind the deregulatory effort here in the United States, and they are the ones who are contributing to the concentration of food production here in the U.S. And thank you very much for your attention, and be happy to answer any questions.
Great. So this is Ben Elliston again, and I'm going to try to get through as many questions as we can here in this remaining 16 minutes or so. So the first question is there an opportunity in China to try to examine this issue of the treatment of animals and ways to improve or mitigate the negative impacts of the globalized industrial meat system, in particular the effects on animal welfare? And maybe we can start with Shefali on that question.
Thanks, Ben. There's no doubt that animal welfare has a direct link to the epidemics and rising problems with disease, antibiotic overuse. One of the central features of an industrialized system is to have these homogeneous animals with the genetic selection to be as fast a growth as possible and to be able to survive in confined spaces. And what this actually does is it ends up reducing their ability to be able to fight disease, which then leads to the need to use antibiotics and all these other things to be able to facilitate their life. And I'm sure Peter Lee can come in and talk about his experience in 2006, 2007 when you got a chance to actually visit these farms to look at what the state of animal welfare is there. And this has been very well documented in the United States. We have enormous problems with animal welfare here, but we also have a really large number of animal welfare groups in this country. The challenge that we see in China is that animal welfare is, and this is why we brought this up as an issue for this webinar, is animal welfare itself is not an issue that resonates with the average Chinese. And Peter, perhaps you can comment here and give your thoughts on this, but food safety is. And so we, as part of our work, are trying to think of ways that we can start to bring awareness to the system, to the structure, to the model. That definitely has something to do also, and that would address animal welfare concerns. But how is it that we can mobilize people and policymakers to start addressing this issue? And for us, I mean, I think food safety is a good way of doing that. And so perhaps it gets at those issues, but it gets at them in the way that might resonate more effectively with policymakers and with the consumers. Peter, did you want to add?
I totally agree. You know, animal welfare is an issue that doesn't resonate with the Chinese public at the moment. If you look at the fact that China still has about 30 million people under poverty line, and also, you know, according to the latest Chinese, standards, about 120 million people under poverty line, which of course they raise the, the bar a little bit in, evaluating the people under poverty line. So this large number of people still, under, nourished, if you will. If you talk about animal welfare, it doesn't resonate with the public, neither does it with the officials. That's why if you look at epidemics, look at the impact on, public health, obesity issue, cardiovascular, issue and cancer issue, and that probably is the, I would say, cutting point for animal welfare groups to do public campaigns.
Well, maybe Dr. Lee, I'll follow up, and there's another question that's sort of along these lines. Is the public health problems of increased meat production in China getting more awareness and understanding, and are there any sort of governmental policies looking at this question?
Yes, the Chinese government has been, looking at, the public health issue. For example, one of the latest, state council, which is the Chinese cabinet, issued a directive to the local governments and also the society at large regarding, food, protein, animal protein intake, and they set the regulation, they set the guideline, so that we understand it is, directed at the fact that, meat consumption is, damaging, the public health. And of course, they try not to, mention industrialized animal farming, even though there has been, debate in the country, between two groups. One group say we should continue to, make, conglomerate type of, animal farming, facilities. There's also other groups saying that we need to, reduce the size, maybe smaller, not so big. But, if you look at both, arguments, we see they're still, focusing on intensive animal farming, still prefer intensive animal farming. The public health, aspect is, gaining more and more attention, and I'm sure that the Chinese government is also, going to issue more, directives. One of the things the public health ministry, was, talking about in the last few years is to increase the hospital beds for the large number of patients. If you look at the, size of the, cancer patients and, people with diabetes, it's enormous pressure on the government to provide, healthcare. That's what I'm saying today. In the past, the food security is a big threat to political stability, regime stability, government's legitimacy. Now, in the future, it's more likely that the government's ability to provide public health care will become a big, regime security, threat, if you will.
And just to add, China, I think just very recently has put out a nutrition plan for 2014 to 2020, which is really looking at obesity as one major issue that needs to be confronted. And I was just exchanging some mails with Fred Gill from USDA, who's a China expert as well, and he actually thinks that this is a sign that the government is actually taking the impacts of overconsumption of meat as seriously, and that this is an indication that perhaps that they're actually going to try and look at the link between obesity and meat. So that was an interesting idea coming. So who knows? I mean, what we found in our research, of course, is all the investors and all the companies are projecting more growth and more production. But at the same time, we are starting to see these trends from a public health perspective that are indicating that perhaps we really need to revisit what nutrition is. So.
Okay, I'm going to keep going on the questions. This one is probably best directed to Tony. Are there U.S. companies presently raising poultry in the U.S., then shipping to approved plants in China for processing to be shipped back to the U.S. for sale?
No, not at this time. Where we're at with this is that China has to certify plants in China that would agree to do the processing. In August of 2013 rather, when FSIS gave China the go-ahead to operate under the 2006 rule, it did audit 4 poultry plants in poultry processing plants in China, and China said that those were likely going to be the 4 plants that would engage under the 2006 rule, where they would cook poultry of either U.S., Canadian, and now Chile is also eligible now to ship raw poultry to China to be processed and then shipped to the United States. Because China has not certified any of their plants, there is nothing going on. There's no processed poultry coming in from China.
Okay. So this next question is about melamine. And it says, when I was in China, it was clear that among young people that they talked to, the melamine scandal in China undermined trust in Chinese milk, and the severe laws against exporting baby milk out of Hong Kong show that there is a demand for non-Chinese products. Are the transnational corporations seeing this as an opportunity to increase their sales in China, and how is that affecting their investments? And maybe we'll start with Shefali on this one if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that has been documented in our dairy report. There was a massive trend with Chinese citizens going abroad to Australia, Hong Kong, Germany, etc., and actually hoarding milk powder to the point where Australia and Germany and others had to issue guidelines that you could only take a certain amount of milk powder abroad. And then you started to see all these companies coming up that were importing this, so providing a service for Chinese consumers in the country to bring that in. And what our report shows is that you've actually started to see, on the one hand, the government then really trying to get the Chinese domestic industry back up and to provide credibility that it's safe. You started seeing Chinese companies trying to adopt foreign names so that they would look like they were foreign brands, or actually going abroad to New Zealand or Australia. There's some ongoing issues around acquiring ranches in New Zealand and Australia where they could produce milk and then bring it back to China. But as one of my slides showed, what we have seen now is that there's a complete kind of takeover of many of the dominant transnationals, like Nestle, like Fonterra and others, and Dumex, that are trying, and Dannon is now in a partnership with Mengniu, that are trying to, that are basically profiting from this. And last year, you know, we saw this price fixing probe by the Chinese government because they had started to really increase the price of infant formula. And when the Chinese authorities cracked down on this, they were forced to reduce those prices. So yeah, it's created a massive shift. And again, the whole issue is around, you know, who's controlling these prices and then what impact is it having further down the value chain.
So we have a number of questions, so I'm going to try to ask the panelists to try to answer quickly so we can kind of knock off a number of them here before we end. Tony, I think this one is for you. Who in the USDA wants to abandon inspections? What are their affiliations and links to industry? So I think it's sort of a question about the industry USDA connection there.
Well, what happened during the Clinton administration was Tyson in particular pushed for a plan to deregulate slaughter inspection, whereas the slaughter inspection, most of the slaughter inspection would be turned over to the companies to do themselves. And so what USDA did in the late 90s was establish pilot projects called the HACCP-based inspection models project in 20 young poultry, young chicken facilities, 5 young turkey facilities, and in 5 pork plants. And they've been running these pilots, you know, like I said, since the late 1990s, and the Obama administration proposed in January of 2012 to expand the model to all poultry facilities here in the United States. And what it would do is it would eliminate 800 USDA inspectors from these poultry facilities. The government, over a 3-year period of time, because they would phase in this new system, would save about $90 million. But the industry, because part of the proposed rule would allow the companies to increase the line speeds from the current maximum of 140 birds per minute to 175 birds a minute. Because of that increased production and fewer regulatory costs, the USDA estimates that the poultry industry would stand to gain $260 million a year in revenue. And so the main proponents from the industry standpoint have been the National Chicken Council and National Turkey Federation, and they also had allies within the White House Office of Management Budget, namely Cass Sunstein, who used to head up the regulatory office within OMB. And like I said, the rule was proposed in January 2012. The comment period closed in May of 2012. But because there's been so much controversy about this, from a food safety standpoint, from a worker safety standpoint, as a matter of fact, there's going to be a group of poultry workers coming to Washington on Thursday to make a pitch to the White House, saying, look, you're not dealing with the worker safety aspect of this rule. You know, there are repetitive motion injuries. You haven't taken that into account. And of course, the congressional investigative arm, the GAO, issued a report in August of 2013 and said that USDA really hasn't made a food safety justification for changing the inspection system. So we're still waiting. The final rule is sitting in Secretary Vilsack's lap right now. He has not transmitted the final rule to the White House Office of Management Budget, but we anticipate that they're going to move ahead, and we think it may come, a final announcement may be part of the president's proposed budget next week.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm going to ask one more question. We only have time for one more, but there were several along these lines, and maybe Dr. Lee can start. But this question is, what kind of space is there in China for NGOs and think policy groups and so forth to raise these issues? Is there a space where consumers in China can see some of these, whether it's safety or health-related issues, and is there a place for universities? Where do we see activity in China around these issues?
One of the measures that the Chinese NGOs can do, by the way, I would say that China has about 30 to 50 million, animal, activists. So it's a huge number of people, concerned about animal welfare. Now, one of the missions Chinese NGOs, Chinese animal activists have been doing is to submit legislative proposal to China's National Congress, which is in session in about 1 week. So they take advantage of the national session, Congress session, and submit the proposal. There have been, a number of, farm animal related proposals submitted. For example, one of the proposals was regarding, stop, pulling the hair off, the Angolan, Angolan rabbits, which was reported in the media. So that's one of the approach to do. So, and also, China has, NGOs across country, which, have been, created in the last, 2 decades. So these NGOs go into universities and publish articles about farm animal welfare, doing public, education. So there are several different channels, and of course there are, university scholars, doing research on farm animal welfare. But mostly they focus on, epidemic, prevention. When they were doing that, they bring up the issue of farm animal welfare. So yes, there is a lot can be done.
Great. And Shefali, any last thoughts on that question?
Just to add, I think someone said, are there social media sites and stuff? And I think there's a lot of media on food safety, which is why there's so much consumer concern. So there is a lot of discussion amongst folks about food safety scandals related to meat and dairy production. I also think that there is a lot of scope with NGOs and think tanks in particular. There's a lot of research institutes in China, and they're doing various research related to animal production. And I think that there's an opportunity to engage on these issues with these think tanks, with groups, in conjunction with animal welfare groups, to start addressing the whole model and to looking at this issue systemically and addressing animal welfare, food safety, health together.
Yeah, just one very quick note. Humane Society International has been launching a meat-free Monday campaign in China in 11 cities and areas. So that has been going on in the last 3 months so far.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists, and I thank everyone who has attended to this webinar. You will receive, if you signed up for this, and if you're on here, you signed up, you will receive an email in the next several days with a link to this webinar, and including the presentation. So you'll be able to forward that around to people you think might be interested, but also to revisit the slides and so forth. So thanks very much for joining us.